Hey guys, Henning and Morten from FlippedNormals here. In this video, we are covering the various maps used in texturing. This is something we've been thinking about a lot, and it's something we see a lot when it comes to new texture artists, that they don't know exactly what the various maps are. You might be looking at an albedo and being like, the hell is an albedo? You're wondering what is the difference between a roughness map, glossiness, what is actually vector displacement map, what the hell is metallic, and what on earth is ambient occlusion. We're going to be covering all these plus a few more maps in this video.
Yeah, so I guess especially when you're just getting into texturing, it can be kind of confusing because a lot of the maps seem to also do similar things. Exactly. So we'll try to shed some light on the different use cases for different kinds of maps as well.
Before we get too deep into it, we want to just quickly talk about this asset. This is made by a very talented texturer or modeler called Simon Pelukin, who's graciously provided this to us. We were also working on a tutorial on how to actually texture this asset, which is coming out when it's ready.
Yeah, maybe in a few weeks or so.
Yeah, let's see about that. So the very first map we're going to be covering is the albedo, or the color map. For this asset here, particularly if you look at the fan, there's actually quite a lot going on, but if we look at the color map, just by hitting the C a few times, we can see the color map. There's hardly anything actually going on. There's a teeny tiny bit of dirt going on, but
stupidly simple,
but it's actually very, very simple. The color map has a few names. Where I've been working, some places we call it an RGB map, some we actually just call it a color, some call it the albedo. I think the albedo is a more technically correct term for it, which is used in PBR.
Some call it diffuse as well.
Yeah.
So it's has a lot of different names.
There's a lot of different names, but essentially what it is the color without any specularity, reflection, or shadows into it.
Which can be hard to, I guess, understand when you're just getting into 3D, because everything you look at around you will never ever only have color on it. It's impossible. Like, you can block out stuff with polarized lenses, but what you're seeing with your eyes will always have reflections and, you know, other kinds of stuff on top.
Yeah, exactly. So what a lot of people do whenever they're starting texturing is they take a photograph of whatever they want to texture, and then they simply project this onto what you're doing. The problem is now you're not getting the color, now you're getting the shadow, and you're getting the reflection into it as well.
Yeah, and reflections can actually water down your color quite a lot.
Yeah.
Like, you can see here, like, how much the spec just adds to the color, like how much whiteness and how less saturated it becomes. Like, if you look at the top, go back to that picture there, the second picture right there, look at the differences between those two. The color, I mean, it's not even the same color.
No.
So that's why it's super important when texturing that you actually have an albedo map.
This is also texturing XYZ. This is the perfect site to use if you actually want to do human textures.
Yeah.
Particularly here, if you're looking at this, how much lighting there is in this. This is all lighting and specularity and all that. There is just too much information there. If you were to project this onto a texture and just leave it at that, you would always have this very white light onto it. Even in this version, which has been polarized, you can still see there is too much lighting information. And whenever I've used these kind of textures, I always had to paint out these subtle little dark spots, and you just really got to remove not just the specular information, but you also got to remove shadow information.
Yeah.
Because otherwise you're fighting that throughout your entire texturing process.
Yeah, then you kind of have, because then once you light it, you know, those areas that you've now textured that already has shadow information are going to get double shadow information. Exactly. And they're going to get even darker.
Now, that said, this is something we do cheat sometimes. Like, if you want more focus on the eyes, we might just leave a bit of shadows here. Mm-hmm. Maybe some of this we might leave. That's also kind of akin to doing makeup on a character as well. But if you want to ground it a bit more, you can kind of fake that a little bit. But in general, the color, albedo, should really just be pure color without any reflections or shadows whatsoever.
Yeah.
So again, if we look at this, just how insanely simple this is and how advanced this here is.
Yeah, like if from the model before, if you take away all the pores and all these small imperfections just in pure color, there's not a lot of stuff happening. Yeah, around the pores you'll have some more reddening, but like especially here on the smaller thumbnails, you can really see, it's easier to get an overview of what the color actually looks like, and it is quite uniform. So it's also pretty simple. But you know, once you get into pores and stuff, then you can start making it more advanced.
Yeah, it really is. This is one big misconception I've seen when people do human texturing. They start off with like a really detailed color map, and they spend 80% of the time on the color map, when in reality something like a bump map, which we get to later on if you don't know what that is where you have all these nice little pores and all that. This is just as important, because if you have a really good bump map, you know, you can go in and you can paint all this in color later on.
Yeah, if not more important almost.
Yeah, exactly.
You know?
I always start off with the bump map and then the roughness map, which we of course will cover that.
It's actually crazy how simple you can sometimes keep your color map if your bump map is super tight.
Yeah. Yeah, that might be the biggest thing which improved my textures significantly, was stop worrying too much about the color and worry way more about bump, specularity, and displacement. If you get those things right, everything else will follow, particularly for characters, which is what I've been doing the most. The next up, let's look at what actually makes this here interesting. When we're looking at the fan, you see there is a lot of variation in here, but it's not in color. So where is it?
It's hiding.
It's in height, it's in roughness. Roughness is one of the most interesting channels and very often overlooked. Roughness essentially determines how sharp or how broad the reflections here are. You can see we have tiny little fingerprints here, and this is all roughness. You can see here, this all reacts to the lighting when we move this around. So
you don't really want this, unless it's paint directly on top of it, you don't really want this in your color map.
No.
Because then it's not going to respond to the light in the same way that it does now. Exactly. It's really cool when you sort of like rotate the light across, that the area that's highlighted by the HDRI is like the same color. It gives this a super very like natural look to it and feel.
Yeah, it really does. So roughness is really one of the most important maps. Back in the old days, before we had PBR, you would paint a lot of specular maps. We don't really do that anymore. Essentially, all the reflections are controlled by a single map, and that's called a roughness map. It can also be called a glossiness map. The difference between these two is that if we look at our roughness map, everything which is dark or black is really sharp, and everything which is white is really broad reflections. In a glossiness map, this is just inverted, literally the only difference between them. But it's important to know that roughness and glossiness are not interchangeable terms.
No.
The maps can easily be used with each other, but you have to invert them. So some shader systems revolve around a roughness map, and some revolve around a glossiness. You just got to figure out which one you're using.
Yeah, and for something like, if it's a broad or a sharp reflection, you can think of like glass or the paint on a car, like the glazing layer on a car. That's a very sharp reflection because it's very perfect. It's like a mirror reflection. But a broader reflection would be something that's like aluminum, anodized aluminum, sort of where the light is really dispersed and you can't see your own reflection in it.
Yeah, exactly. A mirror would have basically black.
Perfect. Yeah.
Also, one thing to keep in mind as well is that everything has reflections. Regardless of what it is, even if it's a piece of clothing, there are still reflections on it. And
it just gets broader and broader to a point where, at least in CG, you don't treat it as a reflection anymore when it's that broad.
Exactly.
But it does.
It still has reflection, and the reason is because stuff reflects on it.
Yeah.
If you have like a light next to this and you can see it reflects, I mean, the light is still there, so it still hits the object. It's more that it's so broad at that point that you can't really see it. But what it would often contribute to is, maybe you can't see it specifically, but it would contribute to overall brightness to whatever it is you're looking at.
You can see that with like an example could be a black t-shirt. Like you have light on a black t-shirt. The t-shirt isn't going to be pure black. No. You're going to be able to see a whitening because it reflects off of all the tiny little fuzzy hairs that's on the t-shirt.
So then we have these are maps which determines more the specularity of it. Then we have displacement, bump, vector displacement, and normal map. So here we are looking at a displacement map. So here we have a black and white map where the white is being pushed out and the black is being pushed in.
So all of these maps are kind of like, they kind of do the same thing, except for vector displacement and displacement map actually move the surface, whereas bump and normal maps give the appearance of moving the surface. But it's all about like getting some sort of new interaction with light going up and down in the surface.
Exactly. So these actually, yeah, these are, all these maps are more like, they're supposed to emulate modeling.
Yeah.
Like in this case here, we just have a plane where we have this, but there is where we have this texture applied to it, but it's just a plane. There is no modeling happened.
Yeah, so this is just the texture that we grabbed from the FlippedNormals fabrics that we have, because I think this just shows it off really well. Like you can see, I mean, obviously this map is huge. This would be for fabric, so be a lot smaller, so you wouldn't see all of this detail, but it illustrates it quite well.
So, like Morten said here, it actually pushes the geometry out, which means it generates geometry. This means that it's quite slow to render, but it's also the most physically correct one.
Yeah.
Because this is not a cheat at all. This actually generates geometry. So
you know, if you have if you were using this for a T-shirt and you wanted it to like be stupidly realistic, you would have a displacement map on it. But like Henning said, it's really, it can get pretty heavy because you actually need to subdivide your mesh. And imagine you know, rendering a T-shirt where you're subdividing enough so that you can render each strand for like the pattern on this T-shirt.
Yeah, that'd be pretty stupid.
Yeah, it's not gonna fly.
No, so you wouldn't do that. So since this is so heavy, this is something which you wouldn't really use in games. In games, you would use a normal map. In film, this is used for everything.
Yeah.
A lot of times in film, they would just straight up refuse to use bump maps even. Which leads us to bump map.
Which looks strangely similar.
Yeah. So this is what you would use for something like this, because this is a cheat. You can tell that obviously it doesn't have the same amount of geometry. You know, it doesn't actually generate any geometry. But this is also really quick to render out.
Yeah, this just gives the appearance of depth instead of having depth.
Yeah.
And the cool thing about this, especially like if we look at the fabric example, we would need to tile this so much to have it look realistic on a T-shirt that I can't see any situation where you would actually use the displacement map unless you're like flying across it or something at like
unless
macro
you're
level.
Here, unless you're
yeah, and then you would probably model it because you want it to look extra crisp, right? So a bump map is really, I mean, we've used that in VFX so much, like where you have your displacement map, and on top of the displacement map, you put a bump map just for the extra fine pore detail.
So one isn't necessarily better than the other.
No.
They're complementing each other. That said, though, if you had unlimited CPU power, you know, if you could render anything and it was all instant, then you would probably stick to displacement, just because it's more correct. It actually generates geometry.
Yeah.
But there is just no way that's happening.
Yeah, the cool thing about the displacement map is that if you took a spotlight pretty close to this plane, the one with the displacement map on, then that would actually, you know, you can actually see it here. It actually casts shadows besides each of the little fibers. But if you go to the bump map instead, you can see we're actually missing those cast shadows. We're only getting sort of like localized shadows on what the bump map is generating.
Then we have a normal map. Normal map is just completely different from what a bump map is. You can see the difference if you look in top left corner is it has 3 colors as opposed to 2. So instead of just going up and down, you can actually get the normal direction of the map, which means it's significantly higher quality when it comes to what information it can portray.
Yeah, you can kind of see that with the normal map, we get a rounding, especially in the highlighted areas. Like you can actually feel that it's a cylinder, whereas with the bump map, it's flat because it can only extract like sort of like pseudo displace up to a certain point, and then it's just up and down. Whereas with the normal map, it goes in like 3 directions, X, Y, and Z. That's what the RGB colors are for in the normal map.
Yeah, so you're going to be seeing this map a lot. If you're seeing a blue and pink map, that's a normal map.
Yeah. But again, you know, you can, maybe it's for games where you, instead of using a displacement map, you use a normal map for the base shape, and then for the super fine detail, then you could use a bump map.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, normal is also used in film as well.
Yeah.
I worked on films where we used a normal map because it's incredibly quick to render.
Yeah.
Like we said, this here is really slow to render. Well, this oftentimes is more than enough for what you need it to.
Yeah, I mean, obviously, there's a tiny bit of difference in render time from a normal map to a bump map, just because you have more detail, but it's really negligible, especially compared to a displacement map.
Yeah, we used a lot of normal maps for Pirates of the Caribbean 5, which you know, you don't have to see that.
Nah.
But at least technically, a lot of it was done with normal maps.
It was a great moving pictures.
Yes. Yes. One of the things as well, the difference between these two maps is how they are generated. So both these maps, specifically these maps, are generated from geometry. So they're baked in a render engine. So this has been modeled up and then baked. But this, you can bake both of these out from geometry, but you can hand paint this, but you can't hand paint this.
Unless you're some sort of artistic genius who can paint in 3 colors and do this.
There's
I mean,
no
it's not
way.
feasible.
There is no way. You have to generate normal maps from geometry. There was just no other way. So, which means that we have tutorials on this as well, where we actually can convert a photo into a bump map, and we can take this into ZBrush, and we can start sculpting more on it, and we can really get very tight details out of it.
The cool thing about hand painting a bump map is that if you're doing it in a texturing software like Painter or Mari, is that you're kind of sculpting, but while you're texturing. So it's like a sculpting texture. You can use it as that as well.
That sounds like an idea for another video. Then we have some examples here where this is a more practical example of where you would use bump map. So here you can see this is with bump map, and this is without a bump map. Let's make this a bit bigger.
And because of the level, like the frequency here, it's such a high frequency for the pores, it doesn't really need to be a normal map. Like it does, the normal map here doesn't need to respond that well to the directions of the normals. Here you just need up and down.
Exactly. So this is a perfect example of where you would use a bump map instead of also displacement map. I've seen this been done with displacement film, but that's honestly a bit stupid. It's
I mean, you could totally use a normal map here as well.
Absolutely.
Totally, that would fly as well. But you know, a bump map will totally do the job.
Yeah, we also had some questions like how do you actually generate these kind of maps, and this is again from the site we showed you before, Texturing XYZ. Not an ad, we just liked them.
Yeah, it's pretty cool.
They just have awesome stuff. Okay, so that's it for these maps. Let's move back into Painter. Then we have an opacity map. An opacity map. Let's go through this. Looks like this. I had to figure out just hide a portion of the model.
Oh, that's why it looked like that. I was wondering.
Because there wasn't really any opacity for it. So opacity map is simply where it's black, it's transparent, and where it's white, it's opaque. So
there we go.
Beautiful, nice little floating thing in space. This is something you would use this for glass or transparent surfaces where you really want to control it. So very nice and simple. Then we have the metallic map. If we look at this now, we can see that different parts here are metallic or made of metal, and different parts are not made of metal. This is one of the things you need to do whenever you're painting, at least particularly if you're using a PBR workflow. You start off with, is this part metal? Yes or no. If it's metal, you make sure that the metallic slider has been set to all the way to 1, and if it's not metal, you turn off again. So this changes the look quite drastically on whatever it is you're doing, like you can see.
Yeah, like technically, I don't know what happens. No. But the way I keep track of it is like Henning says, is a metal? Yes. Is a metal? No. Then it's pretty straightforward that way.
And there is essentially no gradients of this. Like you can see that, you can have a gradient, but in reality you have, is it a metal? Yes or no. You have some exception like metalloids, which might be like tin and arsenic. There might be some examples here, but those, you would look at those as exceptions.
And here you can see, like, if you take the metallic sliders to like down 50%, it kind of looks like, oh, there's some dirt on top or something. But then you would actually just make this 100% metal, and then have a mask with dirt on top.
Exactly. So this is purely a mask. This looks like, let's see if we can go to the metallic one. So here we can see that this here is, the metal parts are indeed metal, and the non-metal parts are not metal. But then we have some parts here which are, it's metal, but it's covered with something else. So you can see that in this case we have black paint on top, and underneath it we have actually like a base metal. One thing to keep in mind as well is that when it comes to, I think we have some examples up here of, no, I hid it with, here we go. Here you have some rust on top of it. Rust is not a metal, not anymore. Essentially, what determines if it's a metal or not, does it conduct electricity or not? If it conducts electricity well, you would use it as a metal. So rust, from a shading point of view, would not be a metal. It used to be.
So would like what do they call, like a superconductor? Like the ones that are ceramic.
That'd
Are they
be like-
technically metals because they conduct
That would be like
electricity?
a super metal.
Wait, do they not conduct electricity? Is that how they work? Oh,
don't
fuck,
know.
I don't know. Teach me about like superconductors in the comments or
Morten
something.
has questions here about
I think I just
superconductors.
confused myself there. So
So shaders are really just built up from a very select few channels here, few textures. You have the color or the albedo, then we have the roughness, which you can see this real nice streaks. Then we have some kind of geometry-based map. It could be a bump, a displacement, or a vector, vector displacement. We didn't talk about that.
yeah, because that's a little hidden gem that we're not using here in Painter.
Yeah, exactly. Also, a quick note as well: a displacement map is interchangeable with a height map. There is no difference between them. It's a black and white map which moves points up and down.
Yeah. But let's look at vector displacement because that's
Before
a
we get-
little surprise.
Yeah.
So, this is from this is from our creature kit in ZBrush where we just have vector displacement maps. Vector displacement maps are kind of like displacement maps, but kind of what a normal map is to a bump map. So with a regular displacement map, it just goes straight up and down. The cool thing about a vector displacement map, again, it contains RG and B, so you can have different kinds of displacements having curvature. You know, having things that occlude each other and then extrude on top of that. Like you wouldn't, like the front view of the ear, the first picture on the left, like you wouldn't have this sort of curvature going into the inside of the ear with a normal displacement map. That would just sort of like be cut off. But the cool thing about vector displacement maps is that they have the ability to sort of have these overhangs, if you will.
Yeah, essentially, this entire shape is one map.
Yeah.
This is a regular plane which is about 1 million polys, and it's been dragged out. This allows you to have way better control over your displacement, which, like Morten said, this here would go straight out like this.
Yeah.
But now it actually curves out like this. So vector displacement is something which is not really being used a whole lot right now. One of the reasons is honestly due to lack of documentation. It's a bit of a pain in the ass to set it up. We used it on Pacific Rim, and that looked really good.
Yeah.
It looked far crisper and had more volume, preserved volume better than regular displacement. But it's just a pain in the ass to set
Yeah, I
up
mean,
from
I get
ZBrush.
it is very comparable to bump versus normal. You could see what the bump map was doing was just pushing up straight up, whereas the normal map got the sort of the nice curvature of the individual strands in there. And a vector displacement map essentially does the same thing, just with actually moving geometry. But it does differ from render engine to render engine, how you need to set it up. And depending on which software you're generating it from, like here for Pacific Rim, we were generating it from ZBrush. And I don't know, we went through 20 different setups where you're like, oh, okay, now the displacement has to be 1 there and 10 there. So it can be quite a hassle to set up, but it does give you a much crisper result.
One practical use of this is, like Morten was saying here, this is from the creature kit, where you can actually make these pieces and just drag them out. So this is pretty much the only use case where I ever use vector displacement, is if I want to kit bash something like this. Then we have a few maps as well, like we're going to talk about some of the maps which are not plugged directly into a shader, but they're more modulating the shader, which can be stuff like cavity, ambient occlusion, curvature, thickness, which they're more there for masking and controlling where stuff happens in the shader. You wouldn't plug something like a curvature into a shader directly. Like there's no curvature slot in the shader. What you could do, you could use it to mask out 2 different materials. So you can get something like this, where you could really mask it out based on curvature or ambient occlusion or whatever it might be. So let's look at what these maps actually look like. First, we have cavity. Let's go back to this, and this has been described way better than we can describe it in this tutorial by Paul Polino, who's a great texture artist who I believe is in Vancouver at the moment. So this is what a cavity map looks like. It's a black and white map, which it's really sharp and it's really good for bringing out details in your sculpt.
It's kind of like if you took a bunch of dirt and you just sort of sprayed it into all the all the cavities. that exist in your model. So we'll like fill it up with a color. That's why it's so nice to use for masking.
Yeah, so this here requires a model.
Yeah.
When if you're talking about a color you can chuck that onto anything. But this needs a model to actually work. It doesn't necessarily have to be a character, it could be anything. And you can generate this using Mudbox or ZBrush, which is quite cool. So the nice thing about this is that now you can take this map into something like Painter or Mari. I've been doing this mostly in Mari. And then you can really get out a lot of this extra details. Remember what we said before about how you shouldn't really have any shadows in your color map? Well, this is where we put shadows into our color map. It just makes it read better. It doesn't have to be multiplied on top where it's black. You can also add color into this.
Yeah.
You can add a bunch of variation into this. I think he actually had some examples showing where to actually use this. Yeah, he has some examples here where you can really just enhance certain details with this.
Yeah. Yeah, so right there you're looking at the albedo, but the albedo has a tiny bit of cavity stuff in there.
Yeah.
Which just makes it, it can be easier to render something that looks realistic.
Then we have ambient occlusion. Let's look under a few of these. Let's go to ambient occlusion. Ambient occlusion is often confused with a lighting map because it has often been used to fake something like global illumination or like ambient lighting.
Yeah.
And it looks really cool. It's one of these where you can present your model like this and you can very easily see what's going on without any lighting interfering or any shadows or anything like that. But this here has nothing to do with lighting. The only thing an ambient occlusion map is doing is looking at where are the pieces close together. So if we look down here, it's not dark because it doesn't have a dark line here because there is any lighting. It has a dark line because there's a lot of geometry here. A good example of this is we can see under, here we go, we see where the cables are. It's really dark because it's so close together.
Yeah. Yeah, so it's basically just to help you ground something. Because real objects in the real world have something equivalent to ambient occlusion, which is just this tiny occluded shadow where two surfaces they contact. And that's basically what ambient occlusion is trying to solve. And instead of having to generate that when you are rendering, then you would have to use a lot of rays and compute it a lot to get that result. You can instead just chuck in an ambient occlusion map, which is basically free to generate. And then, your objects are a lot more grounded already.
Yeah, already this looks kind of good.
Yeah.
It feels more grounded here. It feels like it has a contact shadow. But don't be fooled. This here is 100% a cheat. There's nothing physically based about this whatsoever, apart from location of the different things. But this map here can really, really be a good help when you want to enhance details. You might often have shots which they're incredibly flat lighting, you can't really see anything, and then you throw on an ambient occlusion map and you can really get some of the details out again.
This is also one of the maps that you can use to mask out stuff. Let's pretend you had dirt or some snow or something that was stuck in between surfaces of things. Having that nice dark line there that the AO generates is also a way to use that as a mask.
And this is really one of the fundamental maps you need in Painter, or in any software, but particularly in Painter, because the smart materials will literally need an animation slot. If you don't have it, like half the materials aren't going to work.
Yeah.
So it's really important to have it, and it would be used in a very simple way to add dirt and tiny little shadows to it. But if you want to use this to modulate the color map, this is something that can be used to very quickly add dirt and wear and tear to it.
Yeah. Yeah, you can see there at the base of the fan, you could have some kind of streaking and some dirt that's collected there at the base where the darkness is, just because, that makes sense with the AO. So
exactly. And you can also render this out as well as a render pass or AOV later on in your render engine, and then you can composite this on top of it.
Yeah, you see that with game engines. If you're playing games and you can adjust the settings, sometimes you have AO settings as well, where you can adjust the quality of it, and that can drastically change the look of the game as well.
Yeah, it can look really cool. One thing to keep in mind when it comes to ambient occlusion is don't just throw your ambient occlusion map in and set it to something like multiply. You should add some color into it. You should treat it as as a worthy component of texturing. You really shouldn't just go crazy with it, because we can tell. You can just tell that, oh, the AO is way too strong.
Yeah, and usually if you generate an AO map and you just slap it on there, put it to multiply, then it's not going to look good.
No.
It's going to look wrong.
Yeah, one of the reasons it would look wrong is because now the shadows or the dirt looks black. The stuff doesn't look black. If you have dirt on your shoes, the dirt isn't black unless you've been walking in ash or something, and there's a bunch of color and everything. So that again goes back to, the observation videos we do where we really talk about all these kind of things.
Yeah.
It's maybe the most common mistake in texturing, at least one of the top 5, is you take your ambient occlusion and you just set it to multiply and you go home and you call it a day. The next up we have curvature. Let's look at curvature. And curvature is pretty much exactly what you would assume. It would look at the angle of your polygons, and it will give you a map based on the curvature. So here we can see there's a lot of curvature going on. There was a lot of change in the curvature. So if you have a table, for instance, the edges of the table would be white. It would light up. And this is really one of the maps which is used so much in Painter. This is the one if you use something like the metal edge where this is just all curvature. So curvature is used heavily in Painter, and you can generate that directly in it.
Yeah, there's not so much to say about curvature maps.
Nope.
I feel like.
But at least it's one of the most core ones.
Yeah.
It's really important that you get this one right.
Yeah, it's like one of the core parts of texturing in Painter, yet it's so simple and self-explanatory. So.
Exactly. That's also why you can see that this here is all white, because it's just a circle. So there's curvature everywhere. And then we have thickness. Thickness is something that for hard surface you wouldn't really use a lot. Maybe there are some use cases, but this is a map which gives you a different value based on the thickness of it. So you can see for really thin objects, it's really dark, and for more thicker objects, it's really bright. This is something you would use a lot to fake subsurface scattering. Let's say you want a subsurface scattering map. You might use this subsurface scattering amount map. You might use this as a basis for it. So this is quite a handy map to have, particularly for subsurface scattering, or maybe some translucency or something. But I don't really find it useful at all for hard surface. Then we have a position map. You just hit the B key to toggle between these. Position maps are awesome. Essentially, every single point on this model has a unique color, which means that you can do all sorts of crazy stuff with this. For instance, you can add gradients from one point to another. So if you want to have a mask which goes from this point to that point, you can totally do that. And this is without generating anything. Like, it doesn't look at the polygons or anything. If you want to do a mask, it purely looks at the mask. It purely looks at the point from there to there.
It's a pretty powerful map, and you can do some crazy stuff with it.
Exactly.
But yeah, it's probably not one of the more core ones, but it does definitely have its use cases. And
it's used a lot in comp.
Yeah.
Because then if you're a compositor, then
I'm just thinking in terms of pure texturing here.
Exactly. You wouldn't use it a lot here. But for comping, it's super useful, because then if you have this thing going through space like this, now you can attach a point to it. You can attach something to it. You can add a card to it, some fire or whatever it might be.
They actually use it a lot when compositing, and they're placing 2D elements in the scene. So like in Nuke or something, like Henning said, you have smoke or fire. It's very easy to place it in a 3D space. It's a 2D space that has a 3D representation of the position pass, and then you can place it in there. So it definitely has a lot of cool use cases. But and even in Painter, there are some things you can do with gradients as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the reasons why Painter is so bloody fast when it comes to all these operations is because these maps are pre-baked. If you were to build a system which didn't have these maps, you want the same functionality, and you were trying to do some kind of edge detection or edge wearing, you would have to generate that every single time. But right now, it's already there. We already have the curvature, so there's nothing to actually compute. So a lot of operations in Painter, you might be like, damn, how is it so fast? Well, it's all because it already has this information. This is something which might actually be quite time consuming to compute if you had to do it on the fly. But it's already done for us.
Yeah.
And that's why baking maps in Painter is so important. Then the last map we're going to be talking about is a very simple one. This is the ID map. This is essentially just masks where each portion you want to mask out has a different color for it, which makes it incredibly easy and fast to texture. So let's say all this here is under one texture set. Now we can simply do a color selection. You know, if you're in a mask, and then you can simply click and drag on it, and then now you have a mask for that area. So if you want a part here, let's say you want only the screws to have a certain specular value, you could very easily mask these out and give them a specular value. So it's an incredibly handy mask to have. It's also often overlooked because when you're texturing, you just want to get started with texturing right away. But I can't stress how important it is to spend time creating proper masks, create proper texture sets, because that way, you know, if you need to access all the bolts, you don't have to go through and select all the bolts with a projection tool or something. You can always just simply just click the color.
It's kind of like having selection sets in 3D,
yeah, exactly.
Where, you know, you just select one part, boop, then you have selected everything. Yeah, it's very handy for masking stuff really quickly.
Yeah. So I think that's it for all the maps right now. There are of course a bunch of different maps we haven't covered, which are way more specialized. But these maps here are some of the general ones. Just to sum it up, in general, to create a good looking shader, you only need like a few maps. You need a color map or albedo just to get what color does it have. Then you need a roughness map to decide or to determine what does the reflection look like and how intense is it. Then we have some kind of mesh map, some kind of a bump or displacement, vector displacement or normal map to decide, you know, does stuff go in and out? Do you have some decals on it? Then we have metallic, which determines is it a metal or is it not a metal? And that's usually only like you can have 4 maps and you can describe pretty much any surface with that.
Yeah, the rest is sort of like, it makes your job a lot easier. And
Exactly.
with all the mesh maps, like cavity, curvature and stuff, it's a lot easier to automate a lot of things, but they aren't necessary for painting textures.
No, exactly. Like an ambient occlusion map isn't necessary at all. It will speed up your work significantly.
Yeah.
But at least in a regular PBR shader, you're not gonna plug in the ambient occlusion anywhere. You might do it in a game engine if you want to fake ambience. You might or fake global illumination or something.
Yeah.
But those maps they're like when I worked in texturing, we call them secondaries, and they might be masks or ambient occlusion or something like that. So I mean, yeah, that's essentially it. Once you understand these maps, you can create essentially anything you want when it comes to texturing in
anything from your imagination.
Anything you can dream up.
But yeah, I guess that's about covers it.
Yeah, exactly. These principles are all universal. Mari, Painter, whatever engine you're rendering in, it's all the same.
Yeah, it's paint. You know, if you're texturing in paint. No, it's but yeah, you can use this for everything. So I guess if you want to see more content like this in the future, more specifically substance and texture stuff, make sure to leave a like, comment, and subscribe. And make sure to turn on notifications so you get notified whenever we put out a new video.